Welcome everyone. For those of you I don't know, I'm Stephanie Draper. I'm the CEO of Bond, and very happy to be here launching the Safeguarding Leadership tool today. It really is a really critical moment for us in terms of really maintaining leadership focus on safeguarding, but also getting into that thorny area of culture. So we all know that critical safeguarding is not just about practice, it has to have the culture that matches it. And so it's not enough to have compliance standards. We really need to live and breathe strong safeguarding cultures. And that's what this tool is all about. And it enables us as leaders to really step forward and play that role in creating those cultures that are needed. And as I'm sure you all are more familiar with than you would want, we know how difficult culture is. And so the tool does some of that heavy lifting for us in terms of having thought through what are the key elements that we need to be thinking about and having conversations about in order to accelerate progress. So it is really brilliant to be able to launch it today. So what the tool does is it helps assess culture in relation to safeguarding and develop clear actions. And those actions are all about preventing harm, but also finding ways to have positive safeguarding cultures that are against sexual exploitation and abuse in the sector. So cultures that prevent and actions that link to that. And I think one of the things that I really like about the tool is that it is both practical and conversational. Like we all know that that culture is about how we relate to each other, and that culture changes a conversation at a time. And so this is a online tool, but it's about enabling those honest conversations with teams that mean that as leaders can get deeper into this work and ensure that we are in a good place, that we're able together with our teams to assess strengths and weaknesses and find those practical actions. And the tool also reminds us what those practical actions are, so that in the midst of the depth of these excellent conversations that we can have, we also can actually track whether or not we're making progress. So it really is a brilliant piece of work, and none of it would have been possible without the amazing Frances Longley and Sally Proudlove, who have been championing this as part of the Safeguarding Working Group on Culture and Leadership for at least 3 years. Probably feels like a lot longer, I imagine. But they have really done such an amazing job. I also want to say a big shout out to Francisca as well, who's been supporting that process and the Bond team. But Sally and Frances have really been driving this on behalf of the sector, and we are indebted to them. And it's great that we can celebrate their achievements and also all benefit from their insight and work today. So today we're going to hear from Frances and Sally, who are going to talk about the origins of the tool, why it was so important, and guide you through how to use it. We're then going to have some breakouts which enable us to have a look and try some things out. There are different elements of the tool, and so the breakouts will be focusing on different parts of it, and then we'll come back together and have a brief Q&A and just reflect on how we can all use it and ensure that we are taking it forward. I think it's really important that we as a sector stay on it from a safeguarding perspective and really do test and apply this tool actively in the coming months. So while Frances and Sally are talking, please can put questions in the chat or write them down and save them for later. I'm sure that if you need to clarify something, that Frances and Sally won't mind that, but we are working on a tight schedule, so there's lots to cover. And the final thing to say is we are recording it so that we can all come back to it if we need to, and others can also benefit who can't be here today. So I think that is all I need to cover. So I'm going to hand over to Frances, who's going to do the fancy important bit.
Thank you so much, Steph, and really good to see so many people here today. I'm going to take you through a couple of slides and then Sally is going to talk in more detail about the work that we've been doing. So bear with me 1 second, on my screen does something curious. Here we go. Great. So I'm just going to start by giving just a bit of the context and reminding us how we have ended up where we are. So you'll remember some of these headlines. These are from 3 years ago. We'll all remember that back in 2018, there was an enormous storm of media coverage and significant kind of soul searching really that went on in our sector. So it started with a story in the Times about Oxfam and continued in stories broken in the Mail and elsewhere about Save the Children. And the stories covered sexual exploitation and abuse, but also sexual harassment and bullying by senior staff. And those two organisations and others which also came into the spotlight have gone through enormous change processes over the last 3 years. There have been Charity Commission investigations and a number of different processes through the International Development Committee in Parliament. So since that time, we as a sector have come together and responded to what was a seismic shock really to all of us. And although we should recognise there were a number of organisations who were already doing significant work in this area of safeguarding before 2018, I think it would be fair to say that since that time, organisations of all sizes across the sector have taken a really fundamental review of their policies and their practices and their attitudes to safeguarding. And we've really foregrounded the fundamental duty of care that safeguarding is for us within international development and humanitarian aid. So since that point in February 2018, Bond has been working closely with 4 NGO safeguarding working groups and with the wider Bond membership and other colleagues across the sector. And we developed, across our 4 working groups, we developed 12 overarching commitments in 4 key areas, which were around survivor support and enhanced accountability, leadership and culture change, minimum standards, and around enhanced capacity and capability. If we can go to the next slide, thank you. One of the things that we've established as part of the process then, we set up 4 working groups, and as Steph has said, Sally and I have been co-chairing the group which was focused on culture and leadership, and it was very much established as a complement to the policy and practice work which was being carried out by the other 3 groups. Because what we all understood across all of the work that was going on was the central role of culture and leadership. We recognise that success in safeguarding is about so much more than compliance. It is ultimately about culture. And we set out to identify what the hallmarks of a healthy safeguarding culture are, and to provide leaders with a tool which would help them to assess and improve their organisation's culture. So we recognise, most importantly, that progress would not just be about systems and policies, not just about compliance, which was very much the focus early on, or about ticking boxes to demonstrate that commitments have been met. We understood that it is about a long-term, sustainable change that requires continuous effort and a willingness to lead the transformation within the sector in a joined-up way across all our organisations. So in response to this challenge, we established a new tool, And Sally and I have worked on this, but I have to say Sally is the expert here, and I'm going to hand over to her in just a moment. What we did was we brought together a working group, which Sally can speak to in more detail because she was very much part of that group and was the leading member of that group. We made sure that the group was representative in a number of different ways. We had survivor representation, we had development and humanitarian expertise, gender-based violence expertise, safeguarding culture expertise, and human resources experience as well. And we set out to build on existing sector standards and resources, gather insights from our field and from others, and to understand and articulate the difference between compliance and culture. And in doing that, to spell out behaviours for leaders and organisations. So I'm going to hand over now to Sally, who can explain a bit more about what we did and talk us through the detail.
Okay, thank you, Frances. It's really, really lovely to be with you all this afternoon. So yeah, moving on to the next slide, please, Francisca. Frances has already mentioned the working group. We wanted to get the right balance of expertise. We recognised that actually, in many ways, this is breaking new ground in thinking about this from a really cultural point of view. Even nailing down what we mean by culture was really tricky for us as a group. The best definition that we came up with was the way that we do things around here, that really there are multiple different ways you can define culture. We didn't want this to be an academic document. We didn't want it to be something that would sort of turn people off in terms of the language seeming to be too academic in how it was presented. We really wanted something that was practical and that was really going to resonate with organisations and that could really be used. So moving on to the next slide, please. What we thought about initially was, what is this gap between compliance and culture? So very often what we found was when we started to do our kind of talking to organisations and research around what we were looking at, when organisations talked about the concept of culture, they would say things like, we've got a really good safeguarding culture in our organisation because everybody does training. Everybody has to do training. And actually, when we started to talk about it, we said, we don't really feel that that's a culture statement. We think that's more of a compliance statement. It's good that everybody does training, but actually that doesn't really tell us how that training is being lived and breathed in your organisation. So what we did, next slide please, was we started to think about what would those things look like if we were to be able to articulate, for example, under the heading of policies and processes, what that would actually look like in process. What would the organisation look and feel like? What behaviour would people observe? And just to say that on the tool, there's a set of slides that does this journey for you. And there's also some guidance on how you can use these slides with organisations sort of more broadly than just the leadership team. But once we started thinking about what actually is the journey we're trying to take people on, that helped us to start identifying some of the content that we've got in the tool. So yeah, we'll go on to the next slide. What we know is that if we address the lower level issues in an organisation, that creates an environment where it's less likely that serious abuse will take place. So there is a relationship between the lower level, if you like, poor practice issues that need to be addressed and the more serious types of abuse. So we were very keen that we didn't just focus on sexual exploitation and abuse, but that we thought about what are the other behaviours you need to see in an organisation to be preventative, so that you don't create an environment where poor practice becomes normal practice. And therefore, you open the door to the normalisation of actually even more serious behaviours within an organisation. So we started to think, particularly we were focusing around leadership, looking at the next slide, please, because what we recognise is that leaders absolutely take the lion's share of responsibility in setting the tone of an organisation. And having worked with multiple organisations, what I've seen is that if leaders really understand and get safeguarding, then really significant change can be made quite quickly. Whereas if organisations do not, if leaders don't understand safeguarding or really aren't committed to it in sort of what they believe and what they live out, then change is much harder to achieve in an organisation. So we started to think about, what do we mean by leadership? What are the things that we're pointing to, that we're looking at? What areas do we want to shine a spotlight on? And these were some of the things that we started to then use as a working group to think about the tool. So we've then developed this tool. We've based the headings on the core humanitarian standards. We wanted there to be some consistency across the sector. We wanted there to be some familiarity. And what the tool does is it's a discussion tool. So the idea is that it is facilitated, that ideally there's an external facilitator, but if that isn't possible, that somebody does take on the role of facilitation. And that it's used as an opportunity to have really challenging conversations within the organisation. So thinking about, how do we really start to get down into the detail of how we're living and breathing safeguarding within our organisation. So this isn't just about ticking a box and saying we've done training. It's really about understanding what it feels like to be in this organisation. Now, I just want to say, we recognise that this is just a tool. So, you know, this isn't the answer to everything. It's not the be all and end all, but it's the place that for many organisations you can potentially start to really have robust conversations about this. We recognise much more work needs to be done, but it's a really good starting point. And if you're not sure how to start that conversation off, this tool will help you do that. This tool will help you start to think, okay, what could this look like in our organisation? How do I, as a leader, lead this process and really enable some challenge? So just flicking through the next 2 slides, we're going to talk you through how this works in practice, but we ended up identifying different themes, as I say, based on the core humanitarian standards, and then we looked at behaviour. We came up with some questions to ask in terms of how you discuss the behaviour. So it's not just about you know, some of them are about things like what training's been completed, but it's also about other things as well. How do we learn from other things in the organisation that maybe have gone wrong or nearly gone wrong? And then there's other kind of more value-based questions as well. And then we started to put in some actions, so some suggested actions organisations can take to start moving towards better change and a more healthy safeguarding culture. And what we're going to do in a second is just talk you through how you use the tool in a very straightforward way, so that you can go away and start using that within your organisations. And just finally to say, I love this example here that was shared by one of the Sport for Development organisations that I've worked with. They talked about safeguarding is a thread and not a blanket. In other words, it's not something you wrap around yourselves once and say, we've done that now, you know, that's our policy and our procedure done. It has to thread through absolutely everything that we do. And what we're trying to do with this tool is to enable conversations to take place so that we can check and challenge in our organisations whether or not that is happening. So I'm going to hand back over, I think, to Francisca, who's going to then, I think, share a video with you.
Any symbol, so I'm asking the question if it's okay. Otherwise, I can wait until the end of the session.
No, go for it now, Malik, and we'll take the question and then we'll show the video.
Just out of interest, like you have said, like you have engaged with like 4 different organizations having different expertise. Sorry if I missed that, but can you share their names? Like who were those organizations you have engaged?
Oh, we engaged with quite a number of organisations, actually. I'm not sure where the 4 came from.
Okay.
We circulated it through a number of different channels. Some of them, I can't remember them all, Malik, I'm sorry. But
that's fine.
Our colleagues in the private sector piloted the tool for us. We discussed it with the Gender Development Network, and there were a number of organisations involved. The Scottish International Development Alliance piloted it for us as well. So there were quite a wide range of organisations that looked at it for us. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
I think the video
This is a discussion-based online tool designed to support leaders to understand what a positive organisational safeguarding culture looks like. Let's get started. This is a quick walkthrough to show facilitators how to run the session. Make sure you've read the How to Use the Tool and Facilitator Guide sections in full. When you're ready to hold your session, select the tool for larger or smaller organisations. The tool is broken down into 6 sections. Choose the section you've decided to start with and click Get Started to get going. Ask everyone in your group to consider how the behaviour relates to their own working environment and their interactions with colleagues and others outside the organisation. Use the questions for you to consider to discuss whether and how the organisation already meets the behaviour. If participants feel the organisation does meet the behaviour, ask for examples. What more could the organisation do to meet the behaviour fully? As observations are shared with the group, someone in the group should make notes on the points covered in the box provided. Remember, there are no right or wrong answers. The more open and honest the discussion, the more useful it will be for improving your safeguarding culture. After discussing all the questions, review the discussion notes and then click on Decide and Record Actions to agree with participants what actions are required to improve the culture of the organisation. Use the Actions for Leaders list as a starting point. But remember, this is not an exhaustive list, and you can add specific actions that are more particular to your organisation. Record the actions in the space provided, including how and when these will be implemented. You'll also need to decide who will be accountable for making sure any changes are carried out. These will form part of your action plan, which you can download at the end of the session. Click on Next Step to discuss the next behaviour in this section. Now repeat this same process for each behaviour listed. After discussing all the behaviours of a section, you can download your discussion notes and action plan. We've also provided a list of related materials that can help implement any actions. Finally, agree a time for reviewing progress and decide which section the organisation will complete next and by when.
Great, thank you. So I think we are going now into breakout groups where we have an opportunity to look at the tool in a little bit more detail and sort of look at it from a practical perspective. And you can either ask questions in the breakout group, but we're also coming back to the plenary at the end, so we can have a question and answer session at the end as well. Sorry, I'm going to ask Lina to help us into our breakout groups now. Thank you.
Hi there, Francisca. We actually we didn't get time to come to Christine's question, so we just wanted to pick that up in the main plenary session, if that's okay, please.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think Mike is running the Q&A, so I'll just hand over to Mike and Christine.
Yes, great. Well, may as well go. If you've got a question, Christine, please. Please go for it.
Oh my God, the pressure.
Better be a good question.
Oh no, I know, that's the thing. I don't think it is a good question, actually. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much. This is really helpful. Really, it looks like it's going to be really useful. CAFOD's invested quite a lot in our training and our safeguarding work over the last few years, and culture is a really important part of it. And So I guess my question, I guess, is how do you see this working in and alongside what an organization's already got? Or do you see this as something that's a little bit kind of, I mean, so forgive me if this is a silly question, but, you know, and I'm not saying that CAFOD, we've got all the answers and aren't we wonderful? I'm definitely not saying that, because there is a lot of work that needs to be done. But just to get a feel for, when you say this is a tool to use, how can it be kind of inserted in different contexts, and as an organization that has already put people through a variety of kind of processes and stuff? I can see the value of it, so please don't take that as a negative.
No, it's a really good question. Well, I suppose it depends on where your organization is at, Christine, and it may be that you're a bit further ahead on the journey. My experience is that there are a lot of organizations that aren't even having this conversation very robustly, to be honest, and I think we need to be having these conversations. And as I said in the presentation, my other experience is that when people talk about culture, they actually slip into talking about compliance, and that was our experience throughout. And when we tested it, what we found was that people actually, there was a bit of a sort of light bulb moment of, okay, what we've been doing is talking about you know, compliance. We've been talking about everybody meeting a tick box or a target, everybody reading a policy or signing code of conduct or having training, all of which is really important, but that's not quite the essence of what we're trying to get at. So you might look at it and think, you know, we've had some of these conversations, and maybe it's a refresher thing, or maybe there's parts of the tool that are useful for you. I think for some other organizations, it will be breaking new ground, actually. I think they won't have really started thinking about these things, and we wanted it to be practical and useful. So the other thing is about, you know, something you could sit down with a staff team, project on a wall, have somebody typing in, have a facilitator, and really get a conversation going. You know, absolutely credit to you if you started doing that. Many organizations haven't. So and just to say that the failings, I think, that happened, that kicked off the crisis, and it you know, it could have been any number of organizations that kicked off the crisis, but I don't think they were policy and procedure failings. I think they were culture failings. They were about behaviors that had become acceptable that never should have been acceptable. And we have to ask ourselves, how does an organization get to that point? You know, how do we as organizations get to that point? So I hope that sort of answers the question a bit.
No, really helpful. Thank you very much. We're in a process now of having a discussion about a safe working culture, or safe and inclusive working culture. So we bring together the kind of questions around safeguarding with a wider question around, you know, inclusion and diversity more generally. And so, you know, it's not to sort of see these things in sort of different categories. It is fundamentally about the respect and value that we have for one another. So yeah, really helpful. Thanks very much.
And it was also about taking it further than, it was also about thinking, how does the organisation feel? What does it feel like to be in this organisation? And how do you know as a leader what it feels like for somebody to work in your organisation? Well, I mean, you know, I've never been sort of asked that question in a leadership position before. So I think it's just interesting to get people, you know, how do we really know, other than like a pulse check type survey, how do we really know? And that was what we were trying to.
Thanks, Christina. Are there any other questions that people would like to raise?
I actually have one more.
Yeah, Kimberly, yeah.
I always have questions. Philip was laughing there. So just in terms of talking about behaviours that are acceptable. So I work within Sierra Leone, and what's a really important thing is to note that the unwritten rules within a culture can be very different. So for example, when I was working, we were teaching some young children, and my colleague, who is Sierra Leonean, she was describing something, and she touched the breast of a small girl just to describe, you know, the growth of and you know, that's an unwritten rule there, that it's okay to do that, for women to to be able to, you know, touch a young girl's body and describe that. So it's really important to kind of link up your tool, I think, with the unwritten rules of, so any organization that has bases in countries around the world, I think it's really important to know and to talk about the unwritten rules while you're talking about that. It's just a point that I've had to think about myself personally. So
yeah, no, it's a really important point. You know, thank you, Kimberly. And you know, look, as the tool gets used, we may reflect on things that could be sort of more strongly put in the tool. We might emphasize things more. Interestingly, one of the organizations that piloted it was one of our sort of private sector colleagues, and they piloted the parts of the tool and certainly the slides that I've mentioned with an implementing partner in Pakistan, and they talked about how it really resonated, you know, for everybody. The example they gave was, and this was their words, that even the driver for the organization really understood the question, well, what's the difference between compliance and culture? And they really understood that thinking. So some of our suggestions in the tool, you know, they might be clunky in a particular cultural context. You might think this doesn't quite work. It's not so much, if I'm honest, about the content. We hope the content's useful. Our pilots have told us that it was, but actually it's about the conversation. It's about the nature of the conversation. So can you have a robust conversation in whatever cultural context that helps you unpick what's the power dynamic going on here? You know, what's the power between that adult and that child? Is that actually okay? You know, how do we, in any culture, how are we asking ourselves those questions and challenging ourselves? So, and recognizing that organizations will have an organizational culture, and within that there will be team cultures. They are then in a local and a national culture. So culture is also an interplay of all sorts of different things, which is really complex, you know. And there's other dynamics like, you know, power to do with gender, race, you know, ability, disability, things like that. So it's all about kind of working with all of that really, and trying to come up with a constructive conversation that moves you in a direction.
Thanks, Kimberly. And I've probably got time for one last question before we close. Well, Francis and Sally, maybe you can just say, if there's no more questions, just what's your ambitions for the tool? Where do you want to see this going?
Well, I mean, you know, it's taken us 3 years to get to this point. We're hoping somebody uses it. That would be good. I mean, look, we want it. I would love for this to start changing the narrative in the conversation. I would like us to start having, you know, this is not going to change the world, this tool, but the conversations we have will or could. And I hope this is part of the journey that we go on in the sector. And I really hope it's useful. So my ambition would be that many organisations have a go at using the tool. I would love you to enjoy using the tool. Obviously, as someone who co-developed it, I would love you all to say that it's brilliant, because that's lovely and affirming for me. But the key thing is that we keep shifting this conversation on. I'm already worried in our sector that our memories are short. And I don't like us operating in an environment where we're frightened of getting caught out by FCDO, or we're frightened of the charity committee. I don't want that environment for us. I want us to do this really well, because I know that our organisations are full of brilliant people who want to do this work well. So my ambition is that this becomes part of the narrative, that people talk about this amongst themselves, that you champion it. Thank you for being here as leaders and for giving this a go. We really, really appreciate it. We cannot do it without you. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it. Francis?
Yeah, thanks, Sal. I would agree absolutely with that. And I think, you know, one of the things is it's been, the last 3 years have been a long, hard slog for the whole sector in all sorts of ways. There's been some really uncomfortable truths. There's been an enormous amount of work done. And I would agree with Sally. I think we've often found ourselves feeling defensive or feeling afraid or feeling worried about the spotlight as a sector. And that's not healthy. And that's one of the things that we know absolutely, as Sally was so rightly saying, we know with safeguarding, if you're afraid to have the conversation, you've got an unhealthy culture. And so the really important thing that we want to get through this tool is to help people, exactly as others have said, and Philippa said in the chat, you know, that to help people to have those conversations, and to be able to recognize shortcomings in their own organizations, and then just, you know, and decide what steps to take, rather than feeling as though you have to know the answer on everything. And I think the other thing about it is that, you know, and Sally and I are really passionate about this, is that safeguarding is absolutely everybody's business. It shouldn't just sit with the safeguarding person, or just with the CEO, or just with HR, or, you know, whoever it is. And the danger, I think, because it has risked becoming bureaucratic and compliance focused, is that it sits with the person who holds that compliance. And then we're not having the conversations, and it gets siloed. And when it gets siloed, it's not going to work. So I think what I really am hoping for is that by using this tool, but also the other things that people are already doing in their own organizations, it puts us in a place where safeguarding is as much about being able to talk about these things, being able to challenge each other constructively, being able to call things out when we need to, but also being able to encourage and explain and support. But that is just everyday conversation for all of us, because when you're having that conversation every day, it really is embedded in your culture, rather than it being, you know, you signed your code of conduct, you've had your training once a year, tick, 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 great, and now it sits with whoever up in a different department. So I think that's what I'm really hoping for, is it will help us all to get involved in the conversation, regardless of the level of experience or confidence we've got in the topic. We can get into that conversation and feel that that's a safe thing to do.
Thanks, Frances. Thanks, Sally. There we must close. I just want to, a couple of things really. One is that, as Sally and Frances have articulated, we need, you know, your help, your engagement with this tool now that it's there. We're looking for some champions for this tool. So we're looking for volunteers to commit to completing at least one section of the tool within their organisation before the Bonn conference. So you've got until the end of May, last week of May. What's the best thing? Is it to get in touch with you directly, Francisca? Is that the best way of doing it? Yeah, so we're looking for you to volunteer yourselves. We've got the next session is with 80 practitioners who are probably going to ask their CEOs to volunteer themselves. So other people will be pushing as well. So please, if you can do that, that would be great. Just like to say a final thank you to Frances and Sally for all the work that they've done over the last 3 years. It's been a kind of arduous journey, particularly in the early years, but also to Philippa Ramsden, Kat Carter, and to Jill Healy and Catherine Gordon as well. Been amazing safeguarding co-chairs and support in terms of the development of the tool. So if you want to stay for the practitioner session, Lena's going to put a link in the chat box now, and you can just click on that and stay. Otherwise, we'll no doubt see you. Please do try and engage with the tool. Try and get your team to work on this. It's so important. And as Sally articulated, you know, we're slightly worried this issue is going away, and we need to kind of make sure that we're completely on the front foot with this at all times. It's so important. And thank you very much for participating today.
I'm going to jump in really quickly and just say I want to echo something that Steph said at the beginning. We would not be here without Francisca. Francisca has been staggeringly good. I mean, just spectacularly, staggeringly, fabulously brilliant all the way through. And we would not be where we are now without all of her professionalism and expertise and commitment and organising and just all round brilliance. And I know, Mike, you've been fantastic all the way through as well, and we've really appreciated a lot of support from other colleagues too, but a lot of it sat on Francisca's shoulders, and I'm hugely grateful, Francisca, for everything you've done and for all of your wisdom and your patience, frankly, with me and Sally when we're totally off topic and we're wittering on, and goodness knows we wouldn't be here without you, so thank you.
Thank you very much, very kind.
Thank you very much, everybody, and see you soon.
Thanks for coming. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.